Wait, how does this work?
You just press the button.
This one?
No, not that one.
You're listening to Press the Button, a Ploughshares Fund podcast dedicated to nuclear policy and national security.
Everything seems impossible till it happens.
Everyone would be affected by a nuclear war.
Our government is planning to spend trillions of dollars to develop new nuclear weapons that we don't need.
You can't win a nuclear war.
We are all experts on nuclear weapons because we are all going to be affected by those nuclear weapons.
And here's today's guest host, Michelle Dover.
Thank you, Del. Welcome, everyone, to this week's episode of Press the Button. I'm Michelle Dover, Director of Programs here at Ploughshares Fund. And as you might have known if you've listened in, I'm hosting the Press the Button while Joe is taking some well-deserved time away from DC. Today's episode is going to cover quite a bit in both nuclear news and nuclear history. On our early warning segment, we'll be covering news coming out of the Middle East, where increased hostilities in the region are raising tensions even further. We'll also be discussing further the prospects for modernization, keeping that conversation going from last week about the Defense Authorization Bill. I'll be joined by Ploughshares Director of Policy, Tom Collina, and the Director of Policy at Women's Action for New Directions, Caroline Dorminey. After that, you'll hear a recent conversation that Joe had with Alex Wellerstein. Alex is a nuclear historian and the creator of NUKEMAP, which is this really fantastic website where you can actually simulate a nuclear detonation using a variety of types of nuclear weapons, and you get to pick your target. It's quite terrifying. He and Joe look through the history of nuclear weapons, their tests, their uses, and discuss what lessons we can take from those that can make today a safer world. And if you tuned in last week, you know that we have given you, our listeners, the opportunity to have your questions answered by Joe. We think this will be a lot of fun, but we need your participation. So if you can send your nuclear and national security questions to press the button at ploughshares.org, we'll have Joe answer them on the podcast in August. A big thanks to those who have already sent them in. And as always, if you like what you hear in our 15th episode today, please remember to comment, share, subscribe, and rate. We always love to hear from you, and your feedback helps us improve the show. But first, the news.
And now, early warning, early warning, early warning, early warning. A 7-minute synopsis of this week's nuclear news.
I'm here with our Director of Policy, Tom Collina, and the Director of Policy at WAND, Caroline Dorminey. Welcome to Press the Button, Caroline. It's great to have you with us. Caroline, I'm sure you and our listeners know how we do the news. We give ourselves a 7-minute time limit. If the president is warned of an incoming nuclear missile, he or she has no more than 7 minutes to assess the threat and decide how to respond. If it takes 7 minutes to start a global nuclear war, then we can definitely do the news in 7 minutes too. So let's go. Tom, on Friday, the Iranian Revolutionary Guard seized a British oil tanker in the Strait of Hormuz after the Guard said it was violating international maritime rules. This comes 2 weeks after the British helped seize another tanker, based on evidence it was carrying Iranian oil to Syria in breach of those sanctions. And, so what does this mean about Iran's willingness to up the ante? Are we in a more dangerous phase of this crisis? Is it steady state? Help us put this in context.
Sure, Michelle. Thanks for having me here. I think this does point to a more dangerous phase of this crisis. I mean, this is a big deal when a country seizes another country's oil tanker. This is a step beyond what we've seen Iran do so far. I mean, yes, it's in retaliation for the British taking an Iranian tanker, but up to now, the Iranians have been, they say they shot down a drone, they've been harassing ships, they've been doing things that may or may not be able to really be linked back to them. But this is the first time they went out and brazenly seized a tanker. They boarded the tanker. They took it back to their port. They have the ship, they have the crew.
Yeah, there's plenty of video that's been released.
This is now a life and death situation. There are hostages involved. This is a big deal. And this, I think, shows that Iran is willing to take the threat of closing the Strait of Hormuz to a whole new level. I mean, if people don't know about the Strait of Hormuz, go look it up on your maps. It is 20 miles wide. There's about 20% of global oil flows through the Strait of Hormuz. This is a big deal. The Iranians have always had the power and potential to close the straits. They haven't wanted to do it because in the past, this would also choke off their own economy, right? It's a double-edged sword. Mm-hmm. They could choke off everyone else's oil. They also choke off their own. But if the United States is choking off Iran's oil exports already, the Iranians have very little to lose by messing with shipping in the Strait of Hormuz. This is the new dangerous situation that I think the Trump administration has brought upon us, is that the Iranians have little to lose and they are now taking risks that they wouldn't have taken before.
So I can understand, that's helpful because now I can see where Iran would see as taking this step as having either, a different set of repercussions, than I would imagine. I was having struggled to think of how this calculate makes sense. But for the British, how did they end up in this situation? And what does this mean for them, where they have been trying to be a go-between in some ways, or a buffer in the U.S.-Iranian relationship?
It's hard to imagine why. The Iranians threatened to take a British tanker days ago. And in fact, there was a previous attempt by the Iranians to mess with a British tanker. In that case, the Brits had military escort. The fact that they didn't have a military escort of this tanker is really confusing. Why they wouldn't have done that is beyond me. But this tanker was out there by itself, alone. You could imagine that this was because the Brits are having a bit of a distraction right now. They're supposed to be choosing a new prime minister this week. So they're a bit distracted, but be that as it may, this was a real oversight, I think, on the Brits' part, and it's gonna really, stress the British system to decide whose side are they on in this crisis, the U.S. or the Iranian side, and clearly now it's going to push them to side with the United States, I think, against the Iranians, and the Brits now have to figure out how they're going to get this tanker back without causing an escalation of this crisis.
Well, this is something we'll continue to watch, and we'll see if there can be any off-ramps that can be negotiated to get that tanker back peacefully. Caroline, this week, in a completely different topic, this week in Washington, we will be consumed by negotiations on the U.S. government budget and debt ceiling. As of right now, those negotiations include an increase in top-line defense and non-defense spending for both the 2020 and 2021 fiscal years. And they would also suspend the debt limit until July of 2021. Already, we're starting to hear questions about whether the U.S. can actually afford this type of spending, which is not a new debate. And for us, in the nuclear world, this is on the heels of discussion about the defense spending bill, which passed the House and is now in committee, in conference, You have a chapter coming out in a new anthology from Cato called America's Nuclear Crossroads, in which you analyze how we can manage nuclear modernization costs. So given all these debates, given your knowledge of the topic, can you give us a sense of what type of political will it will take to rein in spending? Does it exist?
First of all, thank you so much for having me here today. I really appreciate it.
We're thrilled.
And second, I'm really excited to see what happens in these negotiations. I think we have a lot of strong legislation coming out of the House of Representatives that really takes aim, or at least starts to take aim, at some of these nuclear policy priorities that have kind of been sacred cows for a very long time in D.C. So we've got, on one hand, the House of Representatives really starting to strategically question some of these priorities. You also have the Republican-held Senate doing none of that strategic thinking. Mm-hmm. The Senate version of the NDAA really falls in line with what the White House already wants. And then at the same time, you've got negotiations happening between leadership and the White House on the debt ceiling and on the overall budget deal. That at some point, all of these different factions are going to have to come together, and there are going to have to be some meaningful compromises from all parties. So it's going to be an interesting time. I'm really excited about the anthology. It actually comes out next week. So next
everyone
Tuesday.
Better check it out.
Absolutely. You can get it online, and there will be physical copies shortly afterwards. But in my chapter, I'm really looking at not just this year, but on a 30-year timeline, what can we afford to spend? And it's not just nuclear spending in isolation. It's also that the Trump White House wants a 355-ship Navy. They also want over 386 squadrons for the Air Force. They want over 500,000 active duty Army. All of these things are coming at the same time. And what we really can't afford to do is invest in all of them. Like, there has to be some strategic choices somewhere.
So that's where this defense spending bill could be the start in those compromises and those changes that would actually set us on a better course.
Absolutely. And, it's really important to keep in mind that just the fiscal year 2020 is not enough. Like, it's a one-year budget. It's going to affect policies that happen in that year. It will affect how we fund things down the road, but we have to make steady progress towards an overall policy vision that is more sustainable and more responsible. That's really what we want FY 2020 to start, but then it has to have some follow through in the out years.
Well, something we'll also be watching closely. The 7 minutes are just about up, but I just wanted to ask if either of you had seen the news about the passing of Yukiya Amano, who was the head of the International Atomic Energy Agency for almost the past decade. It was unexpected. He was just reelected to his third term. He was planning to step down early in March for due to an illness, but it just really sad news out of Vienna today.
Yes, a real loss, I think, for all of us, certainly his family and colleagues, but also to the whole nonproliferation effort. He was a great leader of the IAEA across the board, but particularly in this latest time of the Iran nuclear deal, where the IAEA played such a key role as the kind of international arbiter of whether Iran was adhering to the deal, which they were until the United States pulled out. So it'll be important that, as great a job as Amano did on that, it'll be really important to find a replacement that can play that same role, who can really be the international police force, in a sense, to give us all confidence that Iran or other countries are abiding by their responsibilities.
And on that somewhat sad note, we'll close out this week's early warning and stay tuned for what is next in nuclear news.
Thanks, Michelle.
Thank you.
It's my pleasure to be here in our San Francisco headquarters with Alex Wellerstein, one of the most famous but unrecognized nuclear experts in the field. That's because many people know about NUKEMAP, your invention, Alex, but don't necessarily know that you invented it. Can you just tell us a little bit about what NUKEMAP is?
Sure. NUKEMAP is a website that allows you to simulate the effects of a nuclear weapon anywhere in the world. And it'll tell you for any weapon size, any weapon type, whatever height of burst you want, if you want to get really technical about it. It'll tell you what happens, and it'll tell you what parts have a lot of radiation, what parts have a lot of blast, what parts would get fallout. You can even put in present weather conditions, and the part I'm sort of most morbidly proud of, it'll give you an estimate of casualties, and that's the tricky. That's one of the trickier technical parts of the website, but I find that helps reinforce what they mean to people more than just circles on a map.
Well, I use it in my talks. For example, I go to my son's high school. I talk to his class, and I bring it up, and I ask the kids, where would you like to drop the bomb? And we do it. Are you still developing it? Is it going through further iterations?
Yeah, it's always under some kind of modification, revision. Some things are small, some things are big. I've been working with a student to make it more mobile friendly because I'm not a very mobile person. So that's a useful thing.
Drop a bomb on your iPhone.
Drop a bomb on
your iPhone. And if somebody
iPhone.
wants to do that, where do they go?
nuclearsecrecy.com/NUKEMAP, or just Google NUKEMAP.
And it comes right up.
It comes right up.
I want to talk to you today about some history questions.
Great.
And we're coming up to the anniversary of Hiroshima, the first use of the bomb. We're coming up to the anniversary of Trinity, the first testing of the bomb at Los Alamos. Let's start with Hiroshima, if you don't mind. If knowing what we know now, would you have dropped the bomb?
That's kind of a trick question, isn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah, a tricky one at least. So, there's a lot that you could think of to answer that. Let me put it this way. If I were a person in 1945 who didn't know what we know now,
yes,
it would have been a very hard thing to formulate an argument against dropping it that was persuasive. And this is what historians sometimes call this overdetermined. There were, for the people at that time, so many good reasons to do it.
Like?
Maybe it would end the war. That's not the only reason they had in mind, but it's one of them. Maybe it would scare the Soviet Union a bit, and that would be useful in the Cold War. My favorite argument, this was one that the scientists put forward. Oppenheimer put this forward, as did Edward Teller, actually. Maybe the best thing you could hope for the first use of the atomic bomb would be for it to be as awful as possible, so that the world would take this seriously, and maybe it wouldn't happen again. They didn't know about Nagasaki, but if you take Nagasaki,
we'll get to Nagasaki in a minute. Yeah. So just the first use.
Yeah,
here.
And so the argument there is, look, this is a bad thing, but this is the first generation bad thing.
But you had a group of scientists, people who were working on the bomb and the Manhattan Project at the University of Chicago, whose job was done at that point. They had to make the fissile material. They made the fissile material, and they issued a report in June of that year saying, don't do it.
Yeah.
Because Germany had been defeated. Yeah. The original purpose was to have the bomb to deter a Nazi bomb we thought were coming. We defeated Nazi Germany, found out that they didn't have a bomb. They weren't anywhere close to making a bomb. And yet we still wanted to use it. And they were saying, don't.
Yeah, this is the Frank report. And they're saying their argument is, which is an interesting argument. And I would say it's not an unthinkable one. They clearly thought it. But it's a tricky sell. The argument was, look, it would be better to go to the world and say, we made this terrible weapon and didn't use it. That would be more persuasive to the world about our intentions. That would be more persuasive to the world about understanding this weapon, and it would be a better introduction. And they even have my favorite aspect of that report, by the way. There's one line that was scratched out from the version that got published, totally scratched out. And it's not clear if it was the scientists who censored it or the military, but it's never been published in any version of it. I was only able to figure out what line it was by finding the original and holding it up to the light to see where the typewriter indentations were. This is in the National Archives. The line was that they feared that the rest of the world would see the United States, if they used the bomb on civilians first, they would see us as a nascent Germany.
Ooh.
And somebody thought that was way too spicy, and they cut that out. Totally gone. And
you mean a nation that was willing to commit genocide?
Yeah, exactly. A nation that might be willing to take over the world. And you can see that argument. They took that a little bit seriously at the time. This is when Stimson goes to his...
Henry Stimson, Secretary of War.
Yeah. And he goes to a group of 4 scientists who is giving him top-level advice. This is Oppenheimer, Fermi, Compton, and Lawrence. And he says, so should we do what they say? Should we just demonstrate the bomb first?
Right. So that was the argument. Announce that you have this, do a demonstration shot so everybody can see it, and then call on Japan to surrender.
Right. And they said, we don't think that would work. I mean, arguably, these people are not qualified to answer that question. No offense to my physicist friends and things like that. But this is a psychological, international relations, political science question. It is not a physics question. But they reject it. And you can see different ways on that. I don't know. I will say that when the people who were most impressed by the bomb initially, since we're with Trinity, were those scientists who were at the test. They were very impressed by that bomb.
Impressed in what way? You mean?
They described it in terms of sort of like sublime awe. There's actually a really great quote. My favorite report is not by the scientists. It was by General Thomas Farrell, who was one of Groves's deputies. And he said it's the thing that the poets reach for but can't quite get. You had to be there, basically. It's sort of this experience that just can't be conveyed in words. You have Hiroshima and Nagasaki. We can come back to those. The first time the world saw the atomic bomb outside of Trinity, this is at the Crossroads tests, totally underwhelmed. People were expecting this sublime, world-changing experience, and they blew up some boats with them. And the basic reporting was this was nothing. This wasn't a big deal. And
when was this?
1946, summer of 1946, so a year after Trinity.
So press are invited.
Press, even Russians were invited. I mean, everybody was invited. The UN was invited.
And it's another atomic bomb test.
Two atomic bomb tests, and the result was people saying, well, that wasn't as big as I thought it would be, which is just to say you could imagine a demonstration being underwhelming if somebody tells you, and to be fair, even within the military, even between the scientists, there were those who would argue this thing is the brand newest thing that's going to destroy everything. It's amazing. And other people saying this looks like a very efficient way to destroy a city, which we already know how to do.
Right.
So this is all I'm saying is you could see the argument that
right. So let's put
by
this in
itself
context.
Might not be enough.
And I've written about this in Bomb Scare, that by the time we did this, the United States had been firebombing cities for several years now and killing hundreds of thousands of civilians in Hamburg, in Dresden, in Tokyo. One of the things about why Hiroshima and Nagasaki were picked is they were one of the few targets that hadn't been bombed.
Right.
And they wanted a clean target, a clean test. Curtis LeMay was dismissive of nuclear weapons. He says, I have suffocated, incinerated, and burned more men, women, and children than either one of these bombs did.
Yeah.
Right? So it was now what had once been unthinkable. The wholesale slaughter of innocent civilians by the end of World War II was now the norm. That's how we waged war.
Yeah, it's interesting that's true. But I would also point out that there were people even then who found that disturbing, which I find kind of heartening. So Stimson, Secretary of War, did not like the firebombing. Very keen on dropping an atomic bomb, but actually tried to stop the firebombing. Learned about it from the newspaper. That's how out of the loop he is on
what we were actually doing.
What we were doing, because the Secretary of War was not a very hands-on role at that time. But later, today we think of it like Secretary of Defense. A lot of what we think of Secretary of Defense is like McNamara forward, where you have a really hands-on Secretary of Defense. Stimson is not that hands-on. He's not that powerful.
Okay, so how about Nagasaki?
Yeah.
So we do Hiroshima at August 6th, and then 3 days later, it's Nagasaki. Was that necessary? Was that justified? What do you think of it now?
I mean, there's really not a lot of evidence that the Nagasaki bombing changed anybody's minds in Japan. The timing is really tight. It's too tight. Really, if the goal is this sort of Nagasaki as the strategic response to Japan not surrendering, they didn't give enough time. And that wasn't actually the plan, 3 days. The plan was to wait more like a week. So here's the sort of timeline broken down, right?
Yes.
Hiroshima was supposed to be dropped around August 3rd. Weather conditions in Japan pushed it to August 6th. The second bomb was supposed to be dropped August 10th. Weather conditions pushed it up to August 9th. So this is the weather dictating things. It's not some kind of complicated strategy. This is because, and if, I'm sure you've been there and know, August in Japan is not great weather. You have a lot of cloud cover. You have a lot of heat. You have all sorts of stuff going on.
I've been to both cities.
Yeah. So that's one issue. The other issue is, let's assume the Japanese are, I don't know, a government, right? Not abstract them. Here's a bunch of people who have been told through propaganda mechanisms that the enemy has used a new weapon to destroy one of their cities. They don't get the news of that until quite late on August 6th. So August 6th in the morning, Hiroshima is destroyed. That cuts it off from contact with the rest of Japan. They know Hiroshima has gone off the map, but they don't know what happened. Was it a big bombing raid? Was it something else? Who knows, right? They get information from the United States, Truman's press release saying, we did this thing. Is Japan just going to believe that? in World War II, all sides engaged with all sorts of propaganda, including about wonder weapons, including even atomic bombs, well before 1945. This was already part of the staple of propaganda statements, freeze bombs and rays that would knock a plane out of the air, all sorts of stuff. What do? They do a pretty reasonable thing. They send scientists to go find out if it's real. So they send one of their top physicists who had been working on their own small fission program to Hiroshima. He gets to Hiroshima. He doesn't write back to them until the end of August 8th. It takes a while to get down there in the trains. He does measurements. He says, okay, great. This is for real. There's enough measurements to say this was one bomb. It was clearly nuclear fission. They're telling the truth. He has very evocative descriptions of the scene. This goes back to the high command. They're sort of thinking, okay, what are we going to do with this? Let's figure that out. Night of August 8th, the Russians declare war on Japan, invade Manchuria. The Japanese high command sets up a meeting for August 9th to talk about the future of the war.
Right.
They go into that meeting more or less with the positions that they leave that meeting, which is they're ready to accept a form of conditional surrender. During that meeting, they get news about Nagasaki. It does not change. They barely even note it. And so this is, again, part of this argument of if Nagasaki was gone, not that we can rerun history, but if it didn't happen, would it have changed anything? There's
the
not a lot
evidence
of
seems to indicate that it would not have.
It's tricky because, they didn't actually surrender at that meeting. They agreed to a conditional surrender. And then the United States rejected that. They were the condition was they maintain the emperor. And so then the United States puts on more conventional bombing, and there's an attempted coup within Japan that gets suppressed. And then finally on August 14th, Hirohito says, we're done. So there's a lot going on in this period.
Which, by the way, the condition they wanted was accepted by the United States.
Yes, later.
The emperor does get to continue. He's not removed.
Yes, right. And
actually, this is one of the myths that Japan unconditionally surrendered. Not quite.
Well, it does on August 14th, Hirohito says, just do what you're going to do, more or less. And they decide, in the end, to honor the one condition. They think that would be better.
Yes.
The one condition they knew that Japan had since earlier that summer. I mean, they'd been tapping their communications. They knew that was the biggest barrier for those who were pushing for a diplomatic end of the war. All of which is to say is there's so many things going on here.
Yes.
And the timeline is so tight that it's really hard to say one way or the other. But Nagasaki seems like a much more minor thing compared with everything else that's going on. That Russian invasion, we know that was a big deal. Was Hiroshima a big deal?
So why was the Russian invasion a big deal? How did that factor into the Japanese thinking?
The Japanese had... for years, had made military projections of what would happen if Russia renounced neutrality and joined the Allies against them.
Right. People actually don't know this. Russia was not at war with Japan. They were our ally against Germany.
Right. They were neutral.
They were neutral.
Yeah.
And then that changes on August
8th. It's a really great moment, if I can tell the story.
Please, go ahead.
Yeah. So the Japanese, those on the high command that wanted a diplomatic outcome, which is not all of them. It's not the militarists, but we're talking about Hirohito. We're talking about the secretary of basically the foreign minister. They're looking for some way out. They get the idea that maybe the Soviet Union will be the intermediary. It'll be able to negotiate with the other allies and come up with a sort of treaty that would end the war without any further fighting. And they keep pushing their ambassador, who's in Moscow, the Japanese ambassador to the Soviet Union, to get a meeting with Molotov. Get a meeting with Molotov, the Soviet foreign minister, and propose this to him. And again, the Americans, we know all about this because we're tapping their foreign communications, so we can see all this discussion happening. We know what they're doing, but the Japanese don't realize that the Soviet Union had already secretly promised us they were going to declare war, and in return, they were going to get all this territory. So Stalin's pretty excited by that, about that idea. By 1945, he doesn't want to negotiate some sort of surrender. He wants the island of Sakhalin. He wants the Kuril Islands. He wants the port of Darien. He's going to get all this stuff that's going to give him access to the Pacific Ocean.
Right. He wants all the stuff back that they lost in the 1904 war.
That and a little more, right? He's Stalin, right?
He's Stalin.
And he's going to get this really great access to the Pacific Ocean, which is going to be pretty useful if you're about to enter into things with the United States, right? And so they keep putting off this meeting between Molotov and this the Japanese ambassador. And finally, on August 8th, they let him have the meeting. And the Japanese ambassador comes in and he says, more or less, he says, hey, I have this idea I want to put out there for you. I'm being colloquial, but more or less. And Molotov says, oh, let me stop you right there. Let me just give you this piece of paper. And he gives him a piece of paper and it says, as of midnight, Soviet Union renounces its neutrality and declares war on Japan. And this guy's thinking, oh boy, right? Like this is not an ideal circumstance for the for the ambassador. He's lost everything. This doesn't go down well in Japan. And he'd actually been telling the Japanese for a while, the Soviets are not going to go for this. I'm watching all these rail cars of Soviet soldiers going east. Where do you think they're going? Right. And they're just saying, no, keep trying. And so he thinks he has like a couple hours, he has like half a day to spare, right? Because it's like the morning or something like that. And he's going to figure out what he's going to tell his supervisors back home, right? No, the Soviets don't specify what time zone midnight is. And so the invasion starts an hour later on Trans-Baikal time. And this is why you don't mess with the Soviets, right? Really grim story. But anyway, what this means for the Japanese is they're going to lose Korea. They're going to lose all of their ability to get their resources from China and Korea and all that, which they are absolutely essential for the war. And their military plan is not, take over the United States. They know they can't do that. Their military plan is to bleed out the United States because they think democracies don't have the fortitude for war, and that once American soldiers start dying, the United States is going to get more interested in signing a treaty with them. But they know that Stalin is not, you can't bleed him out. He will happily trade lives for territory. He's done it before. And they also know what happens when Stalin takes over your territory. It doesn't work out well. You end up with Poland and East Germany and all of these kinds of things. So this is the argument about why this loomed very high for them. And again, they had already done, I had only learned this recently, that the army had repeatedly done studies on what would happen if the Soviet Union renounced neutrality. And the answer was they would destroy us. Just completely destroy us. We wouldn't be able to hold them back. And so this really weighed on them really heavily.
So as an historian, weighing these factors, which has the greater weight on Japan's decision to surrender? The Russian declaration of war or the U.S. dropping of the bomb on Hiroshima?
I can't disentangle
You can't.
them. And this is the unsatisfying answer. There's some people.
Can I get another historian in here? Maybe a panel of three.
Yeah, there are some people who will say, I don't think Hiroshima mattered. The Russian thing alone would have done it.
Yes.
There are some people who would say, look, it's clearly both of these had some effect on them, though. Can you rerun history and get a different result? I don't know. I will say, and I'm not saying this is the right answer, the U.S. Strategic Bombing Survey in the Pacific War, it had its own axe to grind, but it concluded that the war would have ended without an invasion, even if the Soviet Union had not entered the war, even if the atomic bombs hadn't been dropped. And it was basing that on the fact that, again, that bombing campaign that destroyed all of Japanese major cities had already done most of the damage. And the United States was mining the rest of Japan's ports, and they were going to run out of food. They were going to run out of resources. They were not going to be able to keep things up. Now, and that's without an invasion. So I'm just putting that out there as this isn't like a crazy, I when I suggest these things to people, they think like this is revisionist history and this is some kind of pinko left-wing commie interpretation. This is the Army's interpretation in 1946. What's true, what's not, I don't know. We can't rerun this. But I think my main historical point is that this is just a lot more complicated than a lot of people recognize.
Okay, let me make it more complicated for you. We had a great conversation with Eric Schlosser a couple of podcasts ago, and I asked him whether he believed in deterrence, whether he believed in the theory of deterrence. And he said, well, there's no question that nuclear weapons play a role in deterring attack. The problem is that nuclear deterrence is a great strategy until it fails, and then it fails catastrophically. And I was wondering what you think. Now, looking back on the 74 years since the Japanese bombings, does nuclear deterrence keep us safe? Is it a sound strategy?
It's hard to find evidence for it. That doesn't mean it's not real. There are some people who say if there's no evidence, it's not real, throw it out the window, fine. But there aren't that many places in history where you can point to a person or a document and say, okay, but if we didn't have nuclear weapons, would you have done it? Is that what constrained you? People didn't sit around and say, well, I'd love to take over France, but if only those pesky nukes weren't there, we wouldn't have done it. Like, that isn't how anybody talks. And it's also, that assumes they would be playing with these hypotheticals like nuclear weapons didn't exist, and they did exist. So, it's hard to do with that. We only have a few cases in which the United States has made a really overt nuclear threat, this isn't even deterrence, this is first use, but like a form of deterrence, right? In a very blunt sense, where we've said, if you do this thing, we'll nuke you. And that's like the Taiwan Strait crisis is one of those.
Yes.
And the result was that the Chinese didn't invade these islands, Quemoy and all of that.
Yes.
On the other hand, they also started their own nuclear program. So, they kind of had a back and forth, ups and downs, right? Win the battle, lose the war kind of thing.
But it also wasn't clear they were going to invade.
Yeah, sure. But it's clear this had an effect on them.
Yeah, it had an effect.
You can sit there.
I think that's true. That's fair.
And the effect that they came away, they actually said, we don't want to be nuclear blackmailed anymore. How do we get around that? We make our own bombs.
Yes.
I similarly, when we blow up Hiroshima, one of the first things that Stalin does is call his scientists together who had already been doing some work on fission work and say, guess what? We're never going to be Japan. So I need you to make me nuclear weapons and missiles. Go. And so they're off to the races.
Right.
So
right.
we can document like that kind of effect really cleanly. If we got rid of our nuclear weapons today, here's another way. Let me put it this way. If we got rid of our nuclear weapons today, do I think that Russia would nuke us off the face of the earth? I find that unlikely. Maybe that's naive. I'm sure somebody could say that. That just does not seem to be in the cards, if you ask me. If we reduced our nuclear weapons by half, wouldn't Russia think that they are twice as likely to nuke us off the face of the earth? I mean, this doesn't sound like a realistic assessment of Russian thought to me. But again, I'm not a military person, but I've talked to Russians. I've talked to people who have worked in various governments. This idea that these other governments are just fantasizing about destroying us constantly
and would launch nuclear weapons if only we didn't have nukes.
There weren't nukes back. This strikes me as very unlikely, and it strikes me as like a Hollywood version of the bad guy. It doesn't strike me as real state actors. There are definitely some bad guys out there in the world in charge of some states, to be sure. Even they, I think, would know that there are other forms of retaliation other than nuclear weapons. I think North Korea knows that if it nuked us, even if we didn't nuke it back, we would end North Korea, right?
Yes.
We have the capability. We're the largest conventional power on the globe.
We did it once before.
I'm just saying I find some of these deterrence discussions to be kind of odd because they seem to imagine, well, let me be generous. They're predicated on the idea that if somebody has the capability to do something, you have to assume they might do it, which is a very worst case scenario military way of thinking. And I get it. I get why they think that way. However, it seems like that thinking also leads you into paths that become kind of counterproductive. So let's have thousands of nuclear weapons. If you imagine them to be any kind of interest, thinking people, now they're going to feel the need for thousands of nuclear weapons too. And now you're locking yourselves into this.
So let me bring you to the current moment.
Yeah.
Do you feel that we are once again entering a nuclear arms race or already in a nuclear arms race, that you see countries reacting to the others' new capabilities by building new capabilities of their own?
Let me put it this way. It's not just me who sees it this way. I've heard people from Strategic Command talk about it this way, where they have said, well, the Russians are putting this thing out, so we're going to put this thing out, and then they're going to put out another thing, and then we're going to put out another thing. And in their eyes, this is the greatest thing since Christmas, because this is going to mean so much more budgets, so much more nukes. The way they talk about this stuff is so enthusiastic.
Yes, they're relevant again.
They are relevant. It's their narrative, which is not totally true, but their narrative is for the last three presidents, Nukes have been, a bad bet career-wise, hasn't been getting the money it needs, blah, blah, blah. But now we're back, baby. Did you know they brought back peace is our profession as their motto? This is what they told me. This is part of their renewal. So I'll just say they seem to think...
The former SAC motto.
Yes. They seem to think that. My hot take on the Are We in a New Arms Race is mainly that we never fully disassembled the previous one. And as you know, a lot of things were going on the whole time under maybe the guise of modernization or increasing accuracy and all sorts of little tit for tats. There are some calculations on the deadliness of the American arsenal that says it peaked not in the 50s and 60s with megatonnage, but the increasing accuracy of it has meant that we could spread our weapons a lot thinner and do a lot more damage, and that it peaked in the 90s or the 2000s.
Yes.
And that's, to me, a sign that you never really undid it. We thought we woke up from the thing, and we didn't wake up from the thing. We're still in the same old dream. And so
nightmare.
Well, exactly. And so if you want to end the arms race, you can't just sort of like change the person at the top and, shake hands with the Russians. You have to actually dismantle the machine.
Wow. Thank you. Nuclear history is long and complicated, and we've just hit a few aspects of it today. I hope you'll come back and talk to me again about some of this.
More than happy to.
Thank you very much, Alex. It's been a real pleasure.
Thanks for listening to Press the Button. This podcast is produced by Delphine Vigil and Zach Brown. Sound design by Derek Zender. Audio engineering by Derek Zender and Will Lowry. Research by Alex Spire. Our theme song is by Lyrics Born and the Poets of Rhythm, sampled with kind permission. Additional music by San Francisco-based bands 17 Evergreen and the Society of Rockets. To continue the dialogue and support our work, visit ploughshares.org.